Today we have with us Professor HS Shiva Prakash, one of India's most respected poets and playwrights. He is also an expert on Bhakti, medieval and classical Indian poetry, and a much respected teacher. He is serving as professor at School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU. Welcome to the program, Mr. HS Shiva Prakash.
Thank you.
Sir, you recently been nominated as the director of Tagore Center in Berlin. So how does it feel, and what do you think? What are your plans at the Tagore Center in Berlin?
This is the first time I'm getting this kind of appointment, and I learned that the center has to promote cultural exchange between India and Germany. And Germany has a very strong traditions of Indological studies, and well known for Sanskrit scholarship. So I think it's going to be a very exciting assignment for me to interact with scholars, academicians and artists of this country who have long been interested in India. So it's going to be a new kind of situation for me.
When did you first start writing poetry, sir? And what made you want to be a poet?
I'd like to believe that I started writing poetry before I was born.
Okay.
Maybe in my past life, but I can't prove it. But the first act of writing poetry, I remember, was at the age of 5. I was in the classroom, my primary school, and we were having an arithmetic class, and I found it very boring. Then I started writing a poem about a peacock.
Okay.
So that was my first poem.
Okay.
And after that, for many years, I did write, but later again, when I went to college, when I was sitting in boring classrooms, the boredom of classrooms that compelled me to write poetry, and then the habit caught on.
Okay. When did you write your first play?
First play I wrote in 1985. That was after nearly 15 years of monogamous commitment to poetry. I didn't want to write anything other than poetry. But I discovered that at the time when I had started writing, poetry had become a sort of minority culture in Karnataka.
Okay.
And I wanted to communicate with, not just with literary intellectuals, not just with literate people, but with the whole society. Then I thought that theatre is a better medium to communicate with people. And then I started trying out my poetry in theatre, and it worked.
Which was your first play, sir?
My first play is Mahachaitra,
Was your first
but before that, a couple of my poems had been staged by the well-known troupe in those days, Samudaya in Bangalore.
Okay.
And this later inspired me to start writing full-fledged plays.
Okay. Your first poetry collection, Milarepa, was published when you were 21.
Yes.
And that collection already shows your interest in mysticism and religion. So how do you see this engagement with spirituality, and how has it informed your poetry and your understanding of spirituality and religion?
I was brought up in a very religious atmosphere, but I never liked religion. I never liked rituals. I never liked conventions. But I was also brought up reading the compositions of great saints of Karnataka, and also saints of Tamil Nadu, because my mother was from Tamil Nadu. I got deeply interested in the poetry of bhaktas and mystics. So that attraction continued in the later parts of my life, even at a time when I had become a complete atheist and a Marxist. And I have always drawn energy from the tradition of our mystical and devotional poetry, and that has been my raw material. I have learned how to use language from these saint poets, and I think the bhakti and mystical tradition is normally identified with religion. I think this is wrong, because some of them were the greatest critiques of religion. So they had a critical engagement with religion, because religion emphasizes conforming to dictates, whereas mysticism emphasizes first-hand experience of the sacred.
You belong to the most popular literary movement in Kannada called Navya movement, and you had among in your generation you had Lankesh, Purnachand Tejasvi, Girish Kanad, and you are Anantmurthy. But you also belong to the postmodern and Dalit movements in Kannada literature, and you have rebelled against these big literary figures like Karnad in the context of Kannada literature, and Badal Sarkar and Vijay Tendulkar in the context of Indian theatre. So why were you rebelling, and what were you trying to do by rebelling? Were you trying? Do you feel that they were against your democratic, pluralistic vision of the world?
Strictly speaking, I don't belong to the modernist Navya generation. I belong to the generation after modernists. So Lankesh and Girish Karnad and Anantmurthy, Professor Anantmurthy, they're all my great predecessors. I learned a great deal from them. And between modernists and me, there is this great literary figure, Chandrasekhar Kambar, who is a phenomenal poet and playwright. He was trying to move away from the modes of modernism in his own way. And also we had this another great literary figure, Purnachandra Tejasvi, who, though he was born into the modernist generation, very quickly moved out of it. And what is modernism as it is practiced in Kannada? Modernism is the emphasis on formal finesse of the work, on the well-made text. But Tejasvi showed a greater philosophical engagement with life, which went beyond the technical and formalistic preoccupations of modernist generation. I don't want to make a reductive statement and say that none of them were interested in social. They were, predominantly were modernists. And the pioneer of Kannada modernism, Gopal Krishna Diga, I still consider him as one of my gurus. And I was very close to him personally, and I consider him one of my gurus. It's not that I rebelled against my predecessors. They belonged to an earlier generation, and their preoccupations were different, and in their formative years, the influences they grew up with were different from those I grew up with. So I wanted to learn from them and move on. And of course, later in my formative years, I had to encounter Dalit and Bandaya movements, and I learned from them also. But because I am not a Dalit by birth, I don't want to describe myself as a Dalit writer, but I had a very close engagement with Dalit writers, and a lot of my work goes back to Dalit traditions, particularly in my plays. And when my play Mahachetra was attacked by a group of fundamentalists in Karnataka, it was Dalits were in the forefront of the defense of this book. So I've learned from modernists, I've learned from Dalits, but I've been myself.
We'll take a short commercial break and we'll continue the conversation. Welcome back. The protest against Mahachetra inspired a very popular novel, In Times of Siege, by Geeta Hariharan. So this novel involves a character who very much resembles you, whose name is also Shiva Murthy, and he has an affair with a student of his who is met with an accident. This generated, it was almost a scandalous novel. So how much of this novel is fictional and how much of it is?
No, I don't agree that it's a scandalous novel. It is a very serious work which depicts the crisis of liberalism in late 20th century. Most of it is fiction. The name resembles mine, and the hero protagonist of this novel has several affairs. One of them with a student, lame student. So that part is purely fictional. I never had such affairs with any student. But the crisis that Shivamurthy, the protagonist, undergoes has lots of similarities with the crisis I went through. But the scale of protest that I experienced in my real life was much bigger than what is depicted in the novel.
You believed in some sort of political struggle, but with the publication of your spiritual autobiography, Bhakti Saraga, I mean, it was widely believed that you have turned mystical and otherworldly. Firstly, is it true that you became mystical and otherworldly with the publication of this book? And but whoever has read the autobiography would know that this is a journey which began very early in your life. So I would like to know about the journey which led you to the mystical journey which led you to write this book.
This book is the result of my lifelong engagement with the paranormal dimension of life. When I look back at Indian history, some of the greatest struggles against conventions were led by bhaktas and mystics. The word mystic is an unfortunate word. We don't have a better word in English. In Kannada, such people who emphasize subjective experience of the sacred are called anubhavis. This anubhava, which of course has a totally different meaning in Kannada than it is in Sanskrit. Anubhava, anubhavis, they want to experience everything first hand. According to me, they were the first existentialists of the world because they believed in the truth of their existence, in experientialism. So that's what was fascinating about the devotional and mystical traditions for me. It doesn't mean that I turned otherworldly all of a sudden. I don't think spirituality is otherworldly. When people talk about gods and goddesses, they're actually talking about human beings. When they're imagining the paradise, paradise is a kind of a transformed version of the world we live in. It's a product of one's imagination of what we want the world to be transformed into.
Recently, after you published your translation of Vachanas, the 12th century medieval Kannada medieval poetry against caste, there was a huge debate because your idea of caste is that it's an exploitative system and it always existed. But the works of S.N. Balagangadhara, he tries to prove that caste has never been that important and it's not been a very exploitative system. So how do you resolve this debate?
I am not a sociologist, neither am I a historian. So it's not my job to give a reply to Balagangadhara. I learned about caste system from my own experience and from my fairly deep reading of ancient and medieval Kannada texts. And I have ample evidence that caste was a problem. Caste was a problem even in the first Kannada poem extant, Pampa's Bharata. Because the character of Karna, the crisis that Karna undergoes in this work is because of caste system. So I have lots of literary evidences to prove that, because literature is, though not in a direct way, even in a more oblique way, it talks about society. And there are references to caste exploitation in Vachanas. In the text I have translated.
Yeah.
And one of critique of Balagangadhara school of thought attacked this and said he has reduced Vachanas to caste abuse.
Yeah.
See, caste critique in an exploitative society sometimes take the form of caste abuse. For example, when Dalit literature came into being in Maharashtra, they used a lot of abusive words because they were so angry with the system.
Yeah.
So, poets are not sociologists.
Definitely.
They can't speak in the cold-blooded language of sociologists.
Yes.
They speak in the full-blooded language of poets.
Yes.
And the caste abuse has to be read as caste critique.
Finally, Professor Shiva Prakash, what is your message to the younger poets in India? How should they understand and respond to the twin paradoxes of extreme materialism on the one hand and then poverty on the other, and then spiritual and moral bankruptcy on the one hand, and religious charlatanism and right-wing wave on the other hand? So, how should they sort of resolve these conflicts and paradoxes that are prevalent in Indian society?
It's not the business of poets alone to solve the problems of the world. But I believe that if they look into their hearts and write sincerely, they'll find a responsive chord in the readers. And ultimately, poetry is born out of love in a very broad sense. What is called by Christians agape, not the individual sex love, but the broad universal love. So poetry inspires that kind of love in people, and I think that is the ultimate solution to most of the ills of society. So as Jalaluddin Rumi said, the singer and the song will all vanish, only the ocean of unity will remain.
Thank you so much, Professor Shiva Prakash.
Thank you very much.